All research, especially when it moves in the sphere of the central question of being, is an ontic possibility of Dasein. The being of Dasein finds its meaning in temporality, but temporality is at the same time the condition of the possibility of historicity as a temporal mode of being of Dasein itself, regardless of whether and how it is a being in time, as a determination.
Let's pause that really quick. Temporality is at the same time the condition of the possibility of historicity as a temporal mode of being of Dasein itself. So historicity, as I understand it, is being in history, right? The sense in which we are historical beings. I should have pre-plugged this in Brian, but I didn't, so we'll plug it in Brian now. So we're just gonna keep moving on. I don't need to sum up. We can just keep moving, but right. So we know that's gonna be the horizon of time. That we're gonna work our way back from temporality to time, and now we need to talk about the task of destructuring of the history of ontology, the root of deconstruction, and in a lot of ways, most of the things that happened in 20th century continental philosophy. And let's add this little note here, right? From temporality being in time to time as such, the ontological structure of time. That's kind of what we figured out is going on here. Then from here we get what we're going to do with section 6, destructuring the I guess it's just not a word, is why it's doing that. Destructuring the history of ontology is where we're going next. Wow, this really takes it out of you. I'm tired, but we're gonna do one more section before I quit for the night. So let's get back to section 6. I should have pre-plugged this in Brian, but I didn't, so we'll plug it in Brian now. The task of a destructuring of the history of ontology. See what you have to say, Brian.
All research, especially when it moves in the sphere of the central question of being, is an ontic possibility of Dasein. The being of Dasein finds its meaning in temporality, but temporality is at the same time the condition of the possibility of historicity as a temporal mode of being of Dasein itself, regardless of whether and how it is a being in time, as a determination.
Let's pause that really quick. Temporality is at the same time the condition of the possibility of historicity as a temporal mode of being of Dasein itself. So historicity, as I understand it, is being in history, right? The sense in which we are historical beings, right? So let me just double check that definition really quickly, actually. This says historical authenticity. Let's do it in terms of Heidegger. Yeah. So it's the sense. Historicity is the sense in which we are grounded in history. We have a relation to time. We always already have a relation to time that determines us as we are. So temporality is at the same time the condition of the possibility of historicity as a temporal mode of being of Dasein itself, regardless of whether and how it is a being in time, right? So maybe I was too hasty in distinguishing temporality and time, right? But temporality in the sense of historicity is the temporal mode of being in time. But in addition to that sense of temporality, there's, the ontological sense of temporality as the condition of that even being possible. Okay. As the determination, historicity is prior to what is called history, where history is world historical occurrences. Historicity means the constitution of being of the occurrence of Dasein as such. It is the ground for the fact that something like the discipline of world history is at all possible and historically belongs to world history, right? So, it's historicity is different from history in the sense of the events that happen, because the events are individual occurrences or even individual beings or individual presences which emerge in the event of historicity, in the event of being thrown into time. So historicity is this more primordial possibility for constituting, for coming into presence, right? The fact of time and the relation to time.
Historicity is prior to what is called history, world historical occurrences. Historicity means the constitution of being of the occurrence of Dasein as such upon its ground, something like world history, and belonging historically to world history, is possible. In its factical being, Dasein always is how and what it already was, whether explicitly or not. It is its past. It is its...
That's interesting. In its factical being, Dasein always is as and what it already was, right? That's that always already sense, that it has a relation to its past, and then in a certain sense it always is its past. It's related to its past. In its factical, and factical I think would be the same as historicity, I think, right? But factical in the sense of, right, a fact is an empirical observation, right? 2 + 2 = 4 is not a fact, right? It's like a logical truth. A fact is the law of gravity or something. A fact is something which is empirical, right? So the factical being of Dasein is the way in which it is, but it always is what it already was. Whether explicitly or not, it is its past, right? So I'm both inseparable from my personal memories, thoughts, hopes, desires, actions that determine me, and also my history, right? Who my family was, what my nation is, what really, all these kinds of things. I'm thrown into this world, and I'm always already determined by it, by history, and by my past.
Its own past, not only in such a way that its past, as it were, pushes itself along behind it, and that it possesses what is past as a property that is still objectively present and at times has an effect on it. Dasein is its past in the manner of its being which, roughly expressed, on each occasion occurs out of its future in its manner of existing at any given time, and thus also with the understanding of being that belongs to it. Dasein grows into a customary interpretation of itself and grows up on that interpretation. It understands itself initially in terms of this interpretation and continually within a certain range, constantly. This understanding discloses the possibilities of its being and regulates them. Its own past, and that always means that of its generation does not follow after Dasein but rather always already goes ahead of it.
Right, so Dasein is its past in the manner of its being which, roughly expressed, on each occasion occurs out of its future. So this is complicated. Right, so the past is not just a thing behind us. Dasein is its past in the manner of its being, which, roughly expressed on each occasion, occurs out of its future. So the past, in its manner of existing at any given time, and accordingly also with the understanding of being that belongs to it, Dasein grows into a customary interpretation of itself and grows up in that interpretation, right? So I think what that means there is that, we interpret ourselves, and how we interpret ourselves determines how we will live our future, what we value, what's important to us. And that is, determined, how we interpret that is determined by our past, right? So, we are our past, in this sense, right? That our past occurs out of our future because we are thrown into the future by the past. Maybe. Oh, Dasein is its past. Oh, no, I'm wrong. It is that, right? It is, and that it possesses what is past as a property that is still objectively present and at times has an effect on it. It is true that our things about our past help us, or not help us, but cause us to have certain views about the world and interpretations of ourselves. But also, Dasein is its past in the manner of its being, which, roughly expressed, on each occasion occurs out of its future, right? In the sense that, I'm not merely present. I'm not merely the now. I have a future. And the past is something which is created at each moment. There's a past behind me. I am cognizant of there being a past. And I recognize my present as my future's past, I think is what he's saying, right? I'm also that, and this is why I care about where am I going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. This is why I make decisions that, are a gift to the future, so to speak, right? Because I'm always conscious of my present as both a future of my past self, right? I am ahead of my past and determine my past in a certain way, and also my present as a past of my future self, right? That my present is a past which has effects on the future self. So there's a way that Dasein is doubly past. It's both determined by its past, and it's the past of its future. I think that's the way to make sense of Dasein is its past in the manner of its being, which, roughly expressed, on each occasion occurs out of its future. Right? To say, and let's actually make sure we don't have anything tricky with the word occur. So we'll Google the definition of occur. Interesting. So occur comes from the Latin occurrere, and it means to run against, or to meet, or to present itself, right? So that actually, we should have looked at that up sooner, because that adds some interesting things. Dasein is its past in the manner of its being, which, roughly expressed, on each occasion occurs out of its future. It runs to meet its future, right? So the past, the present, and the future are always meeting, right? And so this is what it means to have historicity and to rethink time as temporal being, right? It's past, present, and future are not unrelated events that never shall meet. It's rather that they're always meeting, and they're always running together and into each other, right? in the manner of existing at any given time, and accordingly also with the understanding of being that belongs to it, Dasein grows into a customary interpretation of itself and grows up in that interpretation. Right, so it's an understanding of being which is not only existing in any given time, but having that time be determined by the stretch of past, present, and future. By the past as it determines the present, by the future as it determines the past, since we make decisions on predictions of the future, right? Things like that. That's how Dasein interprets itself and grows up in that interpretation and understands itself to have being. Right, so like he says, it understands itself in terms of this interpretation at first, and within a certain range, constantly. Right, that this interpretation is kind of constantly pressing against us. This understanding discloses the possibilities of its being and regulates them. Right, obviously, if you know Foucault, this is something Foucault runs with, the idea of, you know, what is possible to be, and it being regulated. The modalities of possibility are determined by this kind of interpretation, by this hermeneutical interpretive work that we're always already inside of. Its own past, and that always means that of its generation, does not follow after Dasein, but rather always already goes ahead of it, right? So, you know, if my generation is millennial, I guess I think that's what he means by generation, unless he means it as a verb being generated. But I think he does mean like your peers, age wise. It doesn't follow after Dasein, but rather always already goes ahead of it, because our future is determined by this past, by our interpretation of our own being. So that running to meet, right? We run into our future to meet our past, right? To meet the way we've been predetermined. Okay, let's let Brian read the next paragraph. Enough of my voice. We want Brian.
This elemental historicity of Dasein can remain concealed from it, but it can also be discovered in a certain way and be properly cultivated. Dasein can discover, preserve, and explicitly pursue tradition, the discovery of tradition, and the disclosure of what it transmits and how it does this, can be undertaken as a task in its own right. Dasein thus assumes the mode of being that involves historical inquiry and research. But the discipline of history, more precisely, the historicality underlying it, is possible only as the kind of being belonging to inquiring Dasein, because Dasein is determined by historicity in the ground of its being. If historicity remains concealed from Dasein, and so long as it does so, the possibility of historical inquiry and discovery of history is denied it. If the discipline of history is lacking, that is no evidence against the historicity of Dasein, rather it is evidence for this constitution of being in a deficient mode. Only because it is historic in the first place can an age lack the discipline of history.
That's interesting. Let me do like I did before. Let me let Brian go again, and this time, instead of letting him read all the way through, I will I'll pause along the way to comment on it.
This elemental historicity of Dasein can remain concealed from it, but it can also be discovered in a certain way and be properly cultivated. Dasein can discover, preserve, and explicitly pursue tradition.
Right. And that's just, yeah, you know, if we are determined by our history, so to speak, right, you know, and in ways, right, you know, we don't think about this, and this is like, or we don't always think about it. Like, you know, if we think of why things are the way they are, I mean, you can trace them back to historical decisions that were made, right? But if you don't do that, then you can kind of make the error of convincing yourself that it just emerged from nowhere, that it was, you know, natural and how things are supposed to be, right? So that's to discover, preserve, and explicitly pursue tradition is to make sense of this, you know, historical genealogy that determines what beings we are and how we are beings and how we are inside of being.
The discovery of tradition, and the disclosure of what it transmits and how it does this, can be undertaken as a task in its own right. Dasein thus assumes the mode of being that involves historical inquiry and research.
Right, so the mode of being like maybe history or historiography or something like that, where it's a mode of being for us where we relate ourselves to our own tradition, right? So it seems like you could say almost that the modes of being, the various modes of being, all kind of come back to these different possibilities, these different biology, physics, literary studies, psychology, these different disciplines, right? And so in this one, it's history, right? And it's the relation between ourselves and one object. It's about a relation. And the relation here would be between us and our tradition, our history. More precisely, the historicality underlying it, right? So that's the mode of being that we adopt in this sense, is the relation between us and our own histories, right? So, okay, let's let Brian read it some more.
But the discipline of history more precisely, the historicality underlying it, is possible only as the kind of being belonging to inquiring Dasein, because Dasein is determined by historicity in the ground of its being. If historicity remains concealed from Dasein, and so long as it does so, the possibility of historical inquiry and discovery of history is denied it.
Right, it's basically, to me it sounds like that's saying, history is not, it's not a set of dates, facts, places, events, whatever, right? Or maybe it is, but underneath at the fundamental level that constitutes what history is, it's determined by historicity, right? By the way in which things come to history and the kind of relation that they have to time. So that makes sense.
The discipline of history is lacking. That is no evidence against the historicity of Dasein, rather it is evidence for this constitution of being in a deficient mode. Only because it is historic in the first place can an age lack the discipline of history.
Only because it is historic in the first place can an age lack the discipline of history. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. Yeah, I guess if you live in an age which has no concern for history and doesn't even recognize the way in which our present is determined by our past, by our historical legacies, traditions, whatever, that means that the history is failing, but that doesn't determine the historicity of Dasein, or mean that Dasein is not within historicity. Rather, being is constituted in a deficient mode, in a mode which does not properly recognize its own historicity. Only because it is historic in the first place can an age lack the discipline of history, right? I'm not sure what that means exactly. Let's actually look up, let's Google historic, the definition. So the definition of historic comes from the Greek historia, narrative or knowing by inquiry. So if it means historic in the sense of in the past, I don't think it means that, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to talk about, an age lacking the discipline of history. I don't think from that. I think probably what it means is something like an age which is historic, which has, becomes remembered in the history books for certain world historical events having taken place there, like, say, the Enlightenment or something. is, yeah, maybe in that sense it lacks a discipline of history, right? In the sense that maybe the Enlightenment, naively believed it could do something radically new or something. Maybe that would be an example of what it means to say that something that is historic in the first place is how an age can lack the discipline of history. But I'm not sure. It's difficult. It's interesting. It's not even necessarily difficult. It's just unclear, right? Like Heidegger could have explained what he meant by that, but he didn't. So woe to him, to us, but also to him. Okay, let's pump the next bit in, Brian.
On the other hand, if Dasein has seized upon its inherent possibility not only of making its existence transparent, but also of inquiring into the meaning of existentiality itself, that is to say, of provisionally inquiring into the meaning of being in general, and if insight into the essential historicity of Dasein has opened up in such inquiry, then it is inevitable that inquiry into being, which was designated with regard to its ontological necessity, is itself characterized by historicity. The elaboration of the question of being must therefore receive its directive to inquire into its own history from the most proper ontological sense of the inquiry itself, as a historical one that means to become historical in a disciplined way in order to come to the positive appropriation of the past, to come into full possession of its most proper possibilities of inquiry. The question of the meaning of being is led to understand itself as historical in accordance with its own way of proceeding, that is, as the provisional explication of Dasein in its temporality and historicity. The preparatory
Let's stop for a second. On the other hand, okay, let's just go.
On the other hand, if Dasein has seized upon its inherent possibility not only of making its existence transparent, but also of inquiring into the meaning of existentiality itself, that is to say, of provisionally inquiring into the meaning of being in general, and if insight into the essential historicity of Dasein has opened up in such inquiry, then it is inevitable that inquiry into being, which was designated with regard to its ontological necessity, is itself characterized by history.
On the other hand, has opened up such an inquiry, then it is inevitable that inquiry into being, which was designated with regard to its ontological necessity, it is itself characterized by historicity, right? I might have to end early tonight. I'm getting a little. My brain is going for some reason. I'm getting tired, but I'll try to go for a little bit more, and maybe we'll just have to finish this chapter tomorrow because I'm slowing down. But also of inquiring into the meaning of existentiality itself, that is to say, a provisionally inquiring into the meaning of being in general. And if insight into the essential historicity of Dasein has opened up in such inquiry, then it is inevitable that inquiry into being, which was designated with regard to its ontological necessity, is itself characterized by historicity. So, we've got some if-then statements here. So let's pick them apart, right? Let's even write them down in the notes. If insight into the essential historicity of Dasein has has opened up. What has it opened up? Has opened up within the sphere of seeking to make the existence of Dasein transparent. So as we know, we're trying to work from ontic existence of Dasein back to the ontological giving of Dasein. But also that when we look at this ontic, what opens up in our inquiry is this concern for the essential historicity of Dasein. So the concern for Dasein's place in time. Then it is inevitable that inquiry into being is itself characterized by historicity, right? So in other words, since there's this relationship of the ontic Dasein to the ontological, then it should follow that since the ontic Dasein is revealed to be determined by or grounded in its historicity, then it's inevitable that inquiry into being, the being as such, the fundamental structures of being that give beings like Dasein, is also characterized by historicity. Now, why is that? I don't know. Has Heidegger given us a good enough answer for that? I'm not 100% sure. We can just sit with the quiet of my failure to understand. So, I guess it's that if we know that there's this special relationship between the ontological structure of being and the ontic structure of Dasein, you know, right? So, and these are the reason that it's, you know, Dasein is that being which takes its own being as an issue, right? It's concerned with the question of being, and also, right, it has an ontological relation because it has a way of a special way of relating to other beings, and that's, I guess, the sense that Dasein is itself ontological, right? That since those ways Dasein has of relating to other beings are tied up with its historicity, so being too is also temporal in the sense of, or characterized by historicity. So let's just put this. The argument for this, I think, is something like being, or Dasein, as we've established, is that being which has a special relationship to being, and that is itself ontological in its mode of relating to other beings. And thus there is an isomorphism between, let's do this, between Dasein and the structure of being. Being is therefore, since Dasein's mode of relating both to itself and to the world is inseparable from its historicity. Its being in time and its relationship to time. Therefore, it must follow that being, or why am I capitalizing it? The structures of being which are maybe the possibilities of relating to which are therefore also constitutive, right? Since these relations are what constitute our existence, therefore it must follow that the structure of being is also has the character of historicity. That makes sense. So there's like a sense that if being has the character of historicity, that it also has something to do with temporality. It's being is not outside of time, I guess, or it is the conditions for time, something like that, or the structure of being is time, or something like that. Okay, so I actually don't feel like I completely solved any of this, but maybe it's we're a little bit closer to making sense of that. Let's let Brian read it, even just from the top.
On the other hand, if Dasein has seized upon its inherent possibility not only of making its existence transparent, but also of inquiring into the meaning of existentiality itself, that is to say, of provisionally inquiring into the meaning of being in general, and if insight into the essential historicity of Dasein has opened up in such inquiry, then it is inevitable that inquiry into being, which was designated with regard to its ontological necessity, is itself characterized by historicity. The elaboration of the question of being must therefore receive its directive to inquire into its own history from the most proper ontological sense of the inquiry itself, as a historical one that means to become historical in a disciplined way in order to come to the positive appropriation of the past, to come into full possession of its most proper possibilities of inquiry.
you can really see where Foucault gets his work from Heidegger here, right? That the elaboration of the question of being must inquire into its own history from the most proper ontological sense of the inquiry itself as a historical one. There's still this question of what it would mean to talk about history in an ontological way, which I think it's going to be, we're going to be told, but it's not immediately apparent how that would even be possible. That means to become historical in a disciplined way in order to come to the positive appropriation of the past, to come into full possession of its most proper possibilities of inquiry, right? The positive appropriations of the past is just, it's really interesting, right? Because to come into full possession of its most proper possibilities of inquiry. Right, so the positive appropriation of the past, right, is just to, reappropriate the tradition that determines us, right, and to not let it be just dead things that happen linearly in the past, but to understand how they still inform the present, and also to bring them forth, right, to, like I was talking about, to scrape off the layers of concepts of history and bring them to life once again. Yeah, like I was saying, you can really see where Foucault gets this, right? The sense of the genealogy of the past and the way it determines what the present in fact is. The only thing I'm still just a little unclear on is what it means to say that this elaboration of the historical is ontological. I think it remains to be seen, but we'll see. The question of the meaning of being is led to understand itself as historical in accordance with its own way of proceeding. That is, as the provisional explication of Dasein in its temporality and historicity. The question of the meaning of being is led to understand itself as historical in accordance with its own way of proceeding. That is, as the provisional explication of Dasein in its temporality and historicity. So I guess when it says that this weird voice, the question of the meaning of being is led to understand, maybe why it's confusing is it just means like Heidegger saying, this is what I'm doing right now, this is where I'm led, but he's doing this, kind of thing where it's like the thinking, which I'm not deciding, but rather the thinking that is following its own path, right? And its own path that it's following is to understand itself as historical in accordance with its own way of proceeding, right? The question of the meaning of being basically is to ask what is the temporality and historicity of Dasein, to see how Dasein is a being as such. I think that's good enough, as good as we're going to do for this paragraph, right? Dasein is determined by its past, and it is its past in a certain way, and the past occurs out of the future, right? Past, present, future are all jumbled up, right? And that means it's a way of saying that Dasein has historicity, and that to think historicity is distinct from thinking of history as just a series of events, but of rather the way that history is the ontological mode of being in time, right? The determinations of time. And so, a proper analysis of Dasein's historicity would understand Dasein as in time and as having this relationship to its past and to its time. And this is obviously also what Heidegger is going to do, I think, if I'm right that this section is the Destruktion section, where he's going to reappropriate the past of the philosophical tradition, but in a certain way also destroy it to open up new possibilities for thinking being. Because it's historicity. It's not just understanding the history of what happened, but the way in which we are determined by our histories. Right. So let's let Brian keep reading.
The question of the meaning of being is led to understand itself as historical in accordance with its own way of proceeding, that is, as the provisional explication of Dasein in its temporality and historicity, the preparatory interpretation of the fundamental structures of Dasein with regard to its usual and average way of being, in which it is also first of all historical, will make the following clear. Dasein not only has the inclination to be entangled in the world in which it is and to interpret itself in terms of that world by its reflected light, at the same time Dasein is also entangled in a tradition which it more or less explicitly grasps. This tradition deprives Dasein of its own leadership in questioning and choosing. This is especially true to that understanding, and its possible development, which is rooted in the most proper being of Dasein, the ontological understanding.
Okay. Dasein not only has the implication to be entangled in the world, at the same time, Dasein is also entangled in its tradition, right? So it's not only being in the world, but it's being in time. It's right that what we are in is both our immediate lived environment, and it's also the tradition and the time and the hopes and desires of our world, right? So there's a certain way in which some of this stuff is pretty complicated, but it's also rather simple in a way. It's that we're living in time, right? And what makes it complicated is what it means to talk about that time ontologically rather than ontically. But what's clear is that from the ontic is where we work our way back to the ontological. And it's pretty clear to say, at least it seems like, to say what it means that we're ontically beings in time. We have past, we have futures, we have histories, we have relations to others. This tradition deprives Dasein of its own leadership in questioning and choosing, right? In a certain sense, the tradition decides for us what questions we will ask, right? So there's a certain way in which it's difficult to even ask the question of being, obviously, because the tradition has either determined the question is not worth asking or it's already been answered. And also in choosing both what we will do and what questions we will ask, right? This is especially true of that understanding. Why does it do this? It's so annoying. I don't understand why I'm sorry. When I try to go right or left, it just shoots me around for God knows what reason. This is especially true of that understanding and its possible development, which is rooted in the most proper being of Dasein, the ontological understanding, right? So, yeah, so I think you can see where this is going. Like I was just comparing it to being, right? But that's precisely what's at stake, is this question of the way in which tradition determines how we can or can't ask the question of the meaning of being, or even can't frame it properly. Okay, so we can add the next 2 paragraphs to Brian and let him read those for us.
The tradition that hereby gains dominance makes what it transmits so little accessible that initially and for the most part it covers it over instead. What has been handed down is handed over to obviousness. It bars access to those original wellsprings out of which the traditional categories and concepts were in part genuinely drawn. The tradition even makes us forget such a provenance altogether. Indeed, it makes us wholly incapable of even understanding that such a return is necessary. The tradition uproots the historicity of Dasein to such a degree that it only takes an interest in the manifold forms of possible types, directions, and standpoints of philosophizing in the most remote and strangest cultures, and with this interest tries to veil its own groundlessness. Consequently, in spite of all historical interest and zeal for a philologically objective interpretation, Dasein no longer understands the most elementary conditions which alone make a positive return to the past possible in the sense of its productive appropriation.
Right, so right, this is kind of like, the formal laid out version of what I was talking about, what I have been talking about, this way that the past is, Heidegger thinks the past, that the weight of tradition covers over the past in a certain way, that those original well springs, right, in this case, probably the initial appearance of being in ancient Greece gets covered over with the weight of tradition. And in fact, it even makes us forget that provenance. It makes us even forget that that there was this emergence in history and just take things for granted. Like I would assume also the understanding of being as a thing. And he says this tradition uproots the historicity of Dasein to such a degree that it only takes an interest in the manifold forms of possible types, directions, and standpoints of philosophizing in the most remote and strangest cultures. And with this interest tries to veil its own groundlessness. Consequently, in spite of all historical interest and zeal for a philologically objective interpretation, Dasein no longer understands the most elementary conditions which alone make a positive return to the past possible, in the sense of its productive appropriation, right? So a return to the past, not in the sense of going back in time, but pulling off the weight of history and recovering those well springs so that they can function yet again. Yeah, that bit about the tradition is kind of weird. I don't know if it's saying like which is something that he definitely changed his mind about later, since if this is what he's saying, since he did all that work on like Eastern thought and things like that. But that like saying like we shouldn't look at other cultures' philosophy or something like that. That's kind of a weird sentence, but the point is, yeah, that it veils its own groundlessness. It veils that it has given up the foundation. In a certain sense, it's accepted like a IOU or something from the Greeks, and said, they figured out being, so we don't have to think about it anymore, right? Which actually has the effect of there being no ground, and that wellspring of being that the Greeks had discovered has been buried. So that makes sense.
The outset, Section 1, we showed that the question of the meaning of being was not only unresolved, not only inadequately formulated, but despite all interests in metaphysics has even been forgotten. Greek ontology and its history, which through many twists and turns still define the conceptual character of philosophy today, are proof of the fact that Dasein understands itself and being in general in terms of the world. The ontology that thus arises deteriorates into a tradition, which allows it to sink to the level of the obvious and become mere material for reworking, as it was for Hegel. Greek ontology thus uprooted becomes a fixed body of doctrine in the Middle Ages. But its systematic is not at all a mere joining together of traditional elements into a single structure. Within the limits of its dogmatic adoption of the fundamental Greek conceptions of being, this systematic contains a great deal of unpretentious work which does make advances. In its scholastic mold, Greek ontology makes the essential transition via the disputation is metaphysici of Sayers into the metaphysics and transcendental philosophy of the modern period. It still determines the foundations and goals of Hegel's logic. Certain distinctive domains of being become visible in the course of this history and become the primary leitmotifs for the subsequent range of problems. Descartes' ego cogito, subject, ego, reason, spirit, person, but, corresponding to the thorough neglect of the question of being, they remain unquestioned with respect to being and the structure of their being. But the categorical content of traditional ontology is transferred to these beings with corresponding formalizations and purely negative restrictions, or else dialectic is called upon to help with an ontological interpretation of the substantiality of the subject.
Yeah, so we actually, I would say we don't really need to talk about that, only because we actually have already talked about it a little bit. I even talked about it the first day, but also, it's a bit straightforward in a way, right? That there's like that that ontology that arises, in ancient Greece, right? And then it's ensnared by tradition, right? But it's, in the Middle Ages, the scholastics take it and turn it into a fixed kind of systematic structure or tradition, and also that's probably a little too loud. It transitions in this kind of systematic mode, which kind of loses the phenomenological immediacy of being that it had for the Greeks. And then it makes the essential transition into metaphysics of the modern period and transcendental philosophy, which, right, I mean, I've been referring to transcendental philosophy this whole time, which Heidegger wants to distinguish himself from. But, I mean, what he's doing has definite connections to transcendental, but it's different in important ways, right? One, it's not metaphysical. Two, it's not systematic. And three, it's not about the mind applying categories to the world. I wish he would say, and I know he has a book on Hegel, at least one, maybe more, so I could read that. I wish he would say in what sense it determines the foundations and goals of Hegel's logic. Insofar as certain distinctive domains of being become visible in the course of this history and henceforth chiefly dominate the range of problems, Descartes' ego cogito, subject, the I, reason, spirit, person. I wish he would just say why, but I think it's like, the way that being gets hardened into, the subject, the I, the mind over and against, matter, the world, the extensions, if we're going with this Descartes thing, and you have these systematic structures and these concepts, right? But the beings just cited remain unquestioned with respect to the being and structure of their being, right? So their being becomes taken for granted, and we lose why the concept was even invented in the first place. What question spurred raising the concept in the first place. But the categorical content of traditional ontology is transferred to these beings with corresponding formalizations and purely negative restrictions, or else dialectic is called upon to help with an ontological interpretation of the substantiality of the subject. Right, so I think Heidegger doesn't like substance at all, and that substance is one of the kind of mistakes that we make with metaphysics. And so maybe dialectic is like Hegel's dialectic is like a attempt at a solution to the static presentism of early modern metaphysics, but it doesn't ultimately get us out of it, because it ultimately is just about figuring out a way to still in the end defend the subject as static substance, the substance that exists. And I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know my Hegel well enough, but yeah, that's that. Let's see. Yeah, I am fading a bit. How much do we have left of this? Got 4 pages left. That's kind of a lot. We'll try. We'll try. Oh, do we actually have 6 pages left? No, we have 4. Okay. We can do this. Well, let's try.
If the question of being is to achieve clarity regarding its own history, a loosening of the sclerotic tradition and a dissolution of the concealments produced by it is necessary. We understand this task as the destruction of the traditional content of ancient ontology, which is to be carried out along the guidelines of the question of being. This destruction is based upon the original experiences in which the first, and subsequently guiding, determinations of being were gained.
Right, so yeah, here it is. Here's the birth of destruction, or which will become deconstruction. We're asking, how can we destroy these structures that have been built up? Right, it's exactly not Hegel, like we talked about. It's not building up of history. It's this wellspring of being that has been just buried on all this junk that has been lost. How do we tear all the structures down, scrape all the grime off the lens, and get back to being as such, back to being in its real, present, vibrant immediacy, right? So he's gonna enact destruction of the history of metaphysical ontology in Western philosophy.
This demonstration of the provenance of the fundamental ontological concepts, as the investigation which displays their birth certificate, has nothing to do with a pernicious relativizing of ontological standpoints. The destruction has just as little the negative sense of disburdening ourselves of the ontological tradition. On the contrary, it should stake out the positive possibilities in that tradition. And that always means to stake out its limits. These are factically given with a specific formulation of the question and the prescribed demarcation of the possible field of investigation. Destruction does not relate itself in a negative way to the past. Its critique concerns today and the dominant way we treat the history of ontology, whether it is conceived as the history of opinions, ideas, or problems. Destruction does not wish to bury the past in nullity. It has a positive intent. Its negative function remains tacit and indirect. That's
kind of funny. As the investigation which displays their birth certificate. Right. But yeah, the origin point, the springing forth, or the birth certificate of these metaphysical concepts back to where they were first, I think also, of Plato's definition of the philosopher as the midwife of ideas, right? The giving birth to ideas or something like that. The destructuring has just as little the negative sense of disburdening ourselves of the ontological tradition, right? So it's neither is it saying that any ontological standpoint is equally valid, I guess, is what he means by relativizing. I mean, which is what relativizing means, right? But in the sense of breaking all the tradition down to say, whatever goes. And it's also not destructuring, it's of getting out of tradition, right? We are determined by tradition, and there's no way out of that. But instead, it's interesting. It says, it sounds Kantian again, right? To do that limiting, to fix its boundaries. It stakes out the positive possibilities of the tradition, right? To unearth in that tradition or reappropriate that tradition, to once again make being come forth or show up or become clear. These are factically given with the specific formulation of the question and the prescribed demarcation of the possible field of investigation, right? So, a certain way that's right. Like we talked about the structuring of the question, the way the question is structured, the way the question is structured determines in advance what we're going to find when we go asking it, if we ask a question differently, or if we reformulate the question of the meaning of being, then we can get different results out of looking at this ontological tradition, I think is what he means there, right? To fix the boundaries has a different positive possibilities that are staked out, and they prescribe the demarcation of what's possible to be investigated, which before now has not been the meaning of the question of being, because it's been taken for granted as already answered, or as not a meaningful question, or whatever, as we've already seen. Negatively, the destructuring is not even related to the past, right? It's the sense of which the past infects and determines the present, right? It's not about, figuring out whether the past was right or wrong. It's about, answering questions for the present, for understanding what understanding of being is possible today, right? And that's possible only through working through this ontological tradition. Its criticism concerns today and the dominant way we treat the history of ontology, whether it be conceived as the history of opinions, ideas, or problems. However, the destructuring does not wish to bury the past in nullity. It has a positive intent. Its negative function remains tacit and indirect. All right, so and that's an important function, like I've talked about elsewhere, of critique, right, as conceived by Kant or whatever, right? Critique is always, negating to put something within its proper boundaries, but that has a productive force, right? Because there's certain things that only become possible when they're brought within a certain limit or a certain boundary. If you see, if you see things up close, they're unintelligible to you. There's too much going on. But when it's limited at a distance in a picture frame, you can see the painting. Right? It has a gestalt in a psychological sense. Remains tacit and indirect. Okay, let's let Brian read a little more before I talk anymore.
Destruction of the history of ontology essentially belongs to the formulation of the question of being and is possible solely within such a formulation. Within the scope of this treatise, which has as its goal a fundamental elaboration of the question of being, the destruction can be carried out only with regard to the fundamentally decisive stages of this history.
Right. So the formulation of the question of being is the destruction of the history of ontology, because so destruction is being tied to destructuring, which has a negative sense of disburdening ourselves. So it's bringing forth being once again. So it's destroying the weight of history, but it also has a positive intent because it recaptures, the source or the wellspring of that tradition. And that's obviously necessary for the elaboration of the question of being, because you have to break down that tradition to bring any of that forth. Yeah. Okay, we got that. That's not too hard. Let's just keep moving along and see what we got next.
This way we can also show why this area had to remain closed to Kant.
I don't know how that got messed up.
In accord with the positive tendency of this destruction, the question must first be asked whether and to what extent in the course of the history of ontology in general the interpretation of being has been thematically connected with the phenomenon of time. We must also ask whether the problematic of temporality, temporalitat, which necessarily belongs here, was fundamentally worked out or could have been. Kant is the first and only one who traversed a stretch of the path toward investigating the dimension of temporality, temporalitat, or allowed himself to be driven there by the compelling force of the phenomena themselves. Only when the problem of temporality, temporalitat, is pinned down can we succeed in casting light on the obscurity of his doctrine of schematism. Furthermore, in this way we can also show why this area had to remain closed to Kant in its real dimensions and in its central ontological function. Kant himself knew that he was venturing forth into an obscure area. This schematism of our understanding as regards appearances and their mere form is an art hidden in the depths of the human soul, the true devices of which are hardly ever to be divined from nature and laid uncovered before our eyes. What it is that Kant shrinks back from here, as it were, must be brought to light thematically and in principle if the expression being, sane, is to have a demonstrable meaning. Ultimately the phenomena to be explicated in the following analysis under the rubric of temporality, temporalitat, are precisely those that determine the most covert judgments of common reason, the analysis of which Kant calls the business of philosophers.
So a lot there, right? And if we had done this in order, we could refer back to our Kant episodes, but we started here instead for unfortunate reasons, but that's okay, right? So in accord with the positive tendency of the destructuring the question, so there's already this question, right? Rather, whether and to what extent in the course of the history of ontology in general, the interpretation of being has been thematically connected with the phenomenon of time. Obviously, Heidegger is making that argument, but is he the first to do it? Has it been done before? And the answer is, of course, it's been done before because Kant did it. And to me, it seems clear that Heidegger and Kant really are not so far apart from one another as it might be suggested that they are, and as Heidegger himself is trying to say that they are. No doubt he's different than Kant, but he's deeply influenced by Kant, I would say. Kant is the first and only one, he says, who traversed a stretch of the path toward investigating the dimension of temporality. Or, right, this is a little bit of a dig at Kant, but saying, I mean, maybe it's a dig, or maybe it's just, that Kant, like him, was following the grand movements of thought. But maybe the phenomena themselves drove him there. And obviously for Kant, right, time along with space is the precondition of what makes the world intelligible, or what brings the world into intelligibility. And for Kant, those things are supplied by the understanding, if I'm correct. Maybe the interplay of the reason and the understanding. But so for Kant, it is kind of, I think Husserl calls it anthropocentrism. It places the human at the center, because space and time end up being supplied by the faculties. But Heidegger, and this is part 3 of Being in Time That He Never Wrote, which is supposed to be an extended critique of Kant. It's only when the problem of temporality is pinned down, right? So that's why we have to do that in the first 2 sections of Being in Time. What temporality is and how temporality determines us. We can show how obscure and confusing and misguided Kant's doctrine of the schematism is. Furthermore, in this way, we can also show why this area had to remain closed to Kant in its real dimensions and in its central ontological function. Kant himself knew that he was venturing forth into an obscure area. So it's something interesting here that sense that it's like almost like this mistake that Kant made wasn't even, because he wasn't smart enough to see it, or he couldn't. He just, made a big error. It's that it was closed to him. That path of thought was closed to him. And it sounds like what Heidegger's saying is that because we had to perform this destruction of the history of ontology, to throw into question some of the underlying concerns and assumptions that were feeding into, all the projects of modern European philosophy, including Kant. So there's this quote from Kant: "The schematism of our understanding as regards appearances and their mere form is an art hidden in the depths of the human soul, the true devices of which are hardly ever to be divined from nature and laid uncovered before our eyes." Right? So there's a certain way in which, this is is it from the Judgment? Doesn't we have to go to the back, I guess, to find out what. But it sounds like maybe something like the Sublime, right? Like that, to really understand it, it's beyond our possibilities of knowledge, right? It's beyond the limits of reason to understand this kind of fundamental schematism which determines the apparition of things. Heidegger says, "What it is that Kant shrinks back from here, as it were, must be brought to light thematically and in principle if the expression being is to have a demonstrable meaning. Ultimately, the phenomena to be explicated in the following analysis under the rubric of temporality are precisely those that determine the most covert judgments of common reason, analysis of which Kant calls the business of philosophers." This was maybe something that would help if I knew Kant better. I'm not sure what the most covert judgment of common reason is. I don't know if that's a quote or not. And let's pull up a definition of covert, which I think I already looked up on a past episode, but I already forgot again. Yeah, covered, right? So the most covert judgments of common reason are those which are the most covered or the most withdrawn or the most concealed. So yeah, it's like, those kinds of things in the background that we take for granted every day, which determine the common reason. Everything we think about, what a human being is there a life after death? What does it mean to be a good person? All these things that we have common reason about, which can change over time, but we have these common judgments. But analyzing those, they're covert because they don't even feel like judgments. They feel like we're just taking them for granted. But unmasking those covert judgments is the business of philosophers, according to Kant, and it seems Heidegger agrees with that. But those phenomena must be explicated under the rubric of temporality, Heidegger thinks. So it seems that Kant thinks about time but doesn't properly succeed because well, I guess we'll see why, but he shrinks away from it presents itself for a moment and then he shrinks away from it. And probably it sounds like because the problem of temporality was not properly pinned down, which Heidegger is going to do now, I guess. And probably why it was not properly pinned down was that history, or that weight of the ontological tradition weighing on it. Okay, let's go to the next paragraph.
The business of philosophers in pursuing the task of destruction along the guideline of the problem of temporality, temporalitat. The following treatise will attempt to interpret the chapter on the schematism and the Kantian doctrine of time developed there. At the same time, we must show what...
Wait. The following treatise will attempt to interpret the chapter on the schematism and the Kantian doctrine of time developed there. Okay.
Kant could never gain insight into the problem of temporality. Temporalitat. Two things prevented this insight: first, the neglect of the question of being in general, and second, in conjunction with this, the lack of a thematic ontology of Dasein, or, in Kantian terms, the lack of a preliminary ontological analytic of the subjectivity of the subject. Instead, despite all his essential advances, Kant dogmatically adopted Descartes' position. Furthermore, although Kant takes this phenomenon back into the subject, his analysis of time remains oriented toward the traditional, vulgar understanding of it. It is this that finally prevented Kant from working out the phenomenon of a transcendental determination of time in its own structure and function. As a consequence of this double effect of the tradition, the decisive connection between time and the I think remained shrouded in complete obscurity. It did not even become a problem. By taking over Descartes' ontological...
Oh, I didn't realize I had the next paragraph from there also. So Kant never gained insight into the problem of temporality, and that's why he could not properly make sense of the schematism. And it looks like, there's two things that cause this problem, right? And let's even put these in the notes, right? Kant was the first philosopher to brush up against the possibility of thinking temporality, but failed to do so for two reasons. One, the neglect of the question of being in general, right? And I think what it would mean something like this is, right, like Kant's setup, where you have things in themselves and also phenomena, the way things appear, and you have these two separate things. That's actually already takes for granted an answer to the question of the meaning of being, and that answer is in fact precisely the answer that we've inherited from the ontological tradition, Heidegger thinks, and that's what's stopping us from, or stopped Kant rather, but us also, but stopped Kant from being able to think temporality at that moment, right? It's the reason that it showed up and then withdrew from him, because he lost the possibility of thinking being, right, as in time rather than as this metaphysical split between phenomena and noumenon. The other one, the second one, he says, is that Kant lacked a thematic ontology of Dasein, right? So, and this is a really good way that Heidegger puts this. It's a good way of thinking about Heidegger's project. He lacked a subjectivity of the subject, right? It's not about doing what Kant does and making philosophy or knowledge or reason or science subjective in the sense of it revolves around the subject, right? You want something outside of that, something more objective, but you don't really want subjective or objective. You want the subjectivity of the subject, something which recognizes that being is changing all the time, spread out over time, but that being is right, it's determined by Dasein, by the way it shows up in temporality, right? So Kant actually fails by adopting Descartes' position, even though he's made these essential advances in the sense of, recognizing the flaws in this kind of metaphysics that Descartes just accepted. He still comes back to, a subject that knows a metaphysical world, right? So it's really interesting the way Heidegger ends this paragraph. The decisive connection between time and the I think remains shrouded in complete obscurity. So it's interesting to say that there's an essential connection between time and the I think. I think in time, I guess, is what he means, right? That there is no purely present, static, metaphysical ego cogitating, right, thinking, right, but that is always happening in time, and it has a relation to time. I guess is what it's suggested there, but it's not 100% clear at this point. And also, right, so, and I guess this is tied to Descartes. He does not properly think about time, right? It's the common understanding of time as, linear T1, T2, T3, and not temporality. Right. Okay. Let's keep going. We're close. We're almost there. I think I will be able to finish it after all, probably. Okay. Thanks, Luminous. I'm fading, but I do want to finish the chapter before I stop. Oh, I skipped a part. Whoops.
By taking over Descartes' ontological position, Kant neglects something essential, an ontology of Dasein. In terms of Descartes' innermost tendency, this omission is a decisive one. With the cogito sum, Descartes claims to prepare a new and secure foundation for philosophy, but what he leaves undetermined in this radical beginning is the manner of being of the res cogitans, more precisely the meaning of being of the sum. Working out the tacit ontological foundations of the cogito sum will constitute the second stage of the destruction of, and the path back into, the history of ontology. The interpretation will demonstrate not only that Descartes had to neglect the question of being altogether, but also why he held the opinion that the absolute being certain of the cogito exempted him from the question of the meaning of the being of this being.
Right. So, Brian's pronouncing it incorrectly. It's cogito sum, and sum means I am, right? Cogito means I think. So cogito sum is I think I am, right? So it's missing. I don't know why the air goes on there. I think, therefore I am, but cogito sum, I think I am, right? So, and of course I am is, it's being, right? So sum is also being, right? So that's, to ignore the meaning of sum is to ignore the question of the meaning of being, right? Now it's interesting that it says the meaning of being of the sum, the meaning of the being of being, basically is like the meaning of the mode of being of this being, right? So the cogito sum, the ego, is the new and secure foundation for philosophy, but Heidegger thinks it's not actually secure because he has not determined the manner of being of this I think, therefore I am, right? So the I think, the I am, is in what mode of being is this I am? And I guess that mode is Dasein, right? It's what Heidegger's going to say. But this is missing. And Kant, since he adopts Descartes' view of the subject, also is missing this, right? So the second stage, I think I missed what the first stage was. Was the first stage... What was the first stage? I guess the first is to ask what is the connection to time, right? So that's what's going on with Kant, and then we move. I guess we're moving back. So we start from Kant and move back to Descartes. Right. So the second step. Where did he say that? The second stage of the destruction of the history of ontology is to work out the tacit ontological foundations of the cogito sum, right? The I am, in what manner am I, and how do I become I in that way? It's how in a certain sense, how do I become a questioning being as I'm figuring where it's going? Let's listen to the rest of this, the next paragraph.
Sayenden. However, with Descartes it is not just a matter of neglect and thus of a complete ontological indeterminateness of the res cogitans civ mens civ animus, the thinking thing, whether it be mind or spirit. Descartes carries out the fundamental reflections of his meditations by applying medieval ontology to this being, say end, which he posits as the fundamentum inconcussum, unshakable foundation. The res cogitans is ontologically determined as ins, and for medieval ontology the meaning of the being of the ins is established in the understanding of it as ins cretum. As the ins infinitum, God is the ins incretum. But createdness, in the broadest sense of something having been produced, is an essential structural moment of the ancient concept of being. The ostensibly new beginning of philosophizing betrays the imposition of an ill-fated prejudice. On the basis of this prejudice later times neglect a thematic ontological analysis of the mind, gemutes, which would be guided by the question of being. Likewise they neglect a critical confrontation with the inherited ancient ontology.
Right. So, So how with Descartes, it's not just a matter of neglect. It's that he's taking, and this is something that's true, obviously, if you read Meditations, sure, he's the first early modern philosopher. If we're making these kind of, it's a fair place to break it, but it's not like it's just a complete break or a radical start from nowhere. You can see the deep influence of the medieval philosophers and the scholastics on Descartes' thought, right? And Heidegger's saying that, of course, he makes these mistakes because he inherits them from the medieval ontology, which in turn, partially inherited them from Greece. The thinking thing, res cogitans, is ontologically determined as ends, which I need to actually Google because I'm not sure what that is. It's an entity or being, an existing thing, right? This is an important thing, actually, right? The beings conceived as entities, right? Which is kind of one of the sins of metaphysics for Heidegger. So an ens creatum is a created thing or a created entity, right? So the thinking thing is directly evolving out of thinking thing in Descartes is directly evolving out of the created thing by God, right? That we are that thing or that being or that entity which is created by God in scholastic philosophy. As the ens infinitum, right, the infinite entity, God is the ens increatum, the non-created entity. But createdness, in the broadest sense of something having been produced, is an essential structural moment of the ancient concept of being. The ostensibly new beginning of philosophizing betrays the imposition of a fatal prejudice. On the basis of this prejudice, later times neglect a thematic ontological analysis of the mind, which would be guided by the question of being. Likewise, they neglect a critical confrontation with the inherited ancient ontology. Okay. On the basis of this prejudice, later times neglect a thematic ontological analysis of the mind, which would be guided by the question of being. I'm not sure what the prejudice is, the imposition of a fatal prejudice. I guess the prejudice is just the res cogitans. Is that right? Is that what's at work here? It's really hard to say. As the ens infinitum, God's is the ens in creatum. But createdness, in the broadest sense of something having been produced, is an essential structural moment of the ancient concept of being. The ostensibly new beginning of philosophizing betrays the imposition of a fatal prejudice. On the basis of this prejudice, later times neglect a thematic ontological analysis of the mind, which would be guided by the question of being. Likewise, they neglect a critical confrontation with the inherited ancient ontology. Let's just keep reading and come back to it, because I don't know what's going on there. But I think if I keep reading, it might, the future might shed some light on the past.
However, with everyone familiar with the medieval period sees that Descartes is dependent upon medieval scholasticism and uses its terminology. But with this discovery nothing is gained philosophically as long as it remains obscure. To what a profound extent medieval ontology influences the way posterity determines or fails to determine the res cogitans ontologically. The full extent of this influence cannot be estimated until the meaning and limits of ancient ontology have been shown by our orientation toward the question of being. In other words, the Destruction sees itself assigned the task of interpreting the foundation of ancient ontology in light of the problematic of temporality, temporalitat. Here it becomes evident that the ancient interpretation of the being of beings is oriented toward the world or nature in the broadest sense, and that it indeed gains its understanding of being from time. The outward evidence of this, but of course only outward, is the determination of the meaning of being as it apexfa or all 6fa, which ontologically and temporally means presence. Anwesenheit, beings are grasped in their being, sane, as presence, that is to say, they are understood with regard to a definite mode of time, the present, Gegenwart.
That's an important word right there. Anwesenheit, presence, right? And this is Heidegger's ultimate critique, like I've been talking about. Metaphysics leads us to understand beings as present, right? So it still has a relation to time, even though time, temporality, historicity is improperly theorized, because time is presence. The present time is what beings are taken as, which is a mistake, Heidegger thinks. Right, so everyone familiar with medieval periods, right, so this influence of the medieval period of the created thing is that it influences ontologically what we understand the thinking thing by. Right, so I guess here we've gone all the way back to destruction, back to ancient ontology, back beyond even the medieval. Here it becomes evident that the ancient interpretation of the being of beings is oriented toward the world or nature in the broadest sense, and that it indeed gains its understanding of being from time, right? So in the ancient sense, ancient Greek sense, being is oriented toward the world, being in the world, related to the world, and it comes from time, or this whole horizon of interactions is determined by time. The meaning of being as presence. beings are grasped in their being as presence. That is to say, they understood with regard to a definite mode of time, the present. Let's. This is good. This is kind of exciting where this is going. Let's just read the next paragraph also, because I think it's easier to talk about this all at once instead of talking about it one by one.
The problem of Greek ontology must, like that of any ontology, take its guideline from Dasein itself. In the ordinary and also the philosophical definition, Dasein, that is, the being of human being, is delineated as nine xof, that creature whose being is essentially determined by its ability to speak. Erati, cf. I section 7b. Is the guideline for arriving at the structures of being of the beings we encounter in speech and discussion. That is why the ancient ontology developed by Plato becomes dialectic. The possibility of a more radical conception of the problem of being grows with the continuing development of the ontological guideline itself, that is, with the hermeneutics of the dialectic, which was a genuine philosophic embarrassment, becomes superfluous. Thus Aristotle no longer has any sympathy for it, because he places it on a more radical foundation and transcends it itself, or as if the simple apprehension of something objectively present in its sheer objective presence, Vorhand and Heit, which Parmenides already used as a guide for interpreting being as the temporal structure of a pure making present of something. Beings, which show themselves in and for this making present and which are understood as genuine beings, are accordingly interpreted with regard to the present, that is to say, they are conceived as presence.
Ousia, which is the Greek word for presence. We're just gonna read all of this, and then I'm going to talk about it all at once. So let's have Ryan read the rest of it.
However, this Greek interpretation of being comes about without any explicit knowledge of the guideline functioning in it, without taking cognizance of or understanding the fundamental ontological function of time, without insight into the ground of the possibility of this function. On the contrary, time itself is taken to be one being among others. The attempt is made to grasp time itself in the structure of its being within the horizon of an understanding of being which is oriented toward time in an inexplicit and naive way. Within the framework of the following fundamental elaboration of the question of being, a detailed temporal interpretation of the foundations of ancient ontology, especially of its scientifically highest and purest stage, that is, in Aristotle, cannot be offered. Instead, we offer an interpretation of Aristotle's treatise on time which can be taken as a way of discerning the basis and limits of the ancient science of being. Aristotle's treatise on time is the first detailed interpretation of this phenomenon that has come down to us. It essentially determined all the subsequent interpretations of time, including that of Bergson. From our analysis of Aristotle's concept of time, it becomes retrospectively clear that the Kantian interpretation moves within the structures developed by Aristotle. This means that Kant's fundamental ontological orientation, despite all the differences implicit in a new inquiry, remains Greek. The question of being attains true concreteness only when we carry out the destruction of the ontological tradition. By so doing, we can thoroughly demonstrate the meaning of our talk about a retrieval of this question. In this field where the matter itself is deeply veiled, 3 any investigation should avoid overestimating its results. For such inquiry is constantly forced to face the possibility of disclosing a still more original and more universal horizon from which it could draw the answer to the question, what does being mean? We can discuss such possibilities seriously and with a positive result only if the question of being has been reawakened and we have reached the point where we can come to terms with it in a controlled fashion.
Okay. So that was nice, actually, to kind of get through that there. We're going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow because there's a lot going on here. And I need to give it the time that it's due, and I'm getting tired. But I'll say just a few things, right? The problem with Greek ontology is as delineated as zoon, logon, ekon. Right? Is that the human is that which is attached to language, and in a certain way, Heidegger does think that, but not in that way. He's going to radically reappropriate and rethink this connection between the human and language. It's interesting here. That the dialectic is kind of thrown away for Aristotle's version. There's so much going on here, and I just can't do it justice without spending some time on it, which is why I really just am going to have to come back to it tomorrow, because it's just getting too late and I'm tired. In fact, I shouldn't even bother trying to talk about it right now, because I'm too tired, and it's there's so much going on there, right? But the short version of it, if we don't dive deeply into it, is just simple enough to say, there is, when you dig through, when Heidegger does what he wants to do, and you destroy the entire tradition of ontology all the way back to its roots in ancient Greece, you will find something. You will uncover, right, this meaning, this understanding of being as presence, as Anwesenheit. And Heidegger does think that that's a key to understanding being. But there's more to being than just presence, because there's also absence. It's actually this play of presence and absence that makes being what it is. And to talk about that, we just have to spend some time on it tomorrow. So thank you to everyone that tuned in today. And if you want to find out the true meaning of the history of being in Western ontology, from ancient Greece through the scholastics, the medievals, and scholastics are the medievals, the early moderns rather, and Hegel into Heidegger, then check back tomorrow. We'll be doing this again, and I will be less tired. Thank you, Luminous Intensity. Thanks for showing up, and thanks for chatting and teaching us about Bergson. Thanks everyone. Have a nice night, and I'll see you tomorrow, perhaps.